Good Friday afternoon, Golden Black Live. We are ready to go. Brian Newbert joins me for segment one. It's always exciting to figure out what the heck we're going to talk about. There's a lot to talk about actually today, and plus we'll take your questions too, obviously in the chat room, and we'll take those as well. Today's show we'll have Mike DeCourcy from the Big Ten Network and Sporting News will join us via phone at 2:20, and Ken Double, a name from the past from Purdue sports fans, former Purdue basketball TV host, and then also worked here at WLFI. We'll have him in the final segment. Brian, the Boilermakers got through Penn State. We're talking Purdue men's basketball first. Step in the right direction, I suppose, from Illinois, but still things not maybe clicking 100% just yet.
I thought they played pretty well against Penn State, but the qualifier there being it was Penn State, obviously a team that's having a difficult season. Obviously, it doesn't have the team it had last year in terms of the offensive firepower. It lost with DJ Newbill and some other really important players that they've had over the years. Purdue had a lot of advantages against Penn State, obviously. Penn State is a very limited team, so I don't think anybody's going to throw a parade because Purdue bounced back from the Illinois game by beating Penn State at home convincingly. I think that should be the expectation level for Purdue at this point. But obviously, anytime you have success coming off a disappointing loss, it's a pretty positive thing. I just thought the thing with Penn State, they couldn't replicate some of the conditions Purdue has failed under against Iowa, against Illinois. They were just a pretty limited team, and thus I don't know if beating Penn State or beating Rutgers, like they almost certainly will come this weekend, are going to really tell you anything about whether the issues that have plagued Purdue to this point have been remedied. The turnover issue did come up against Penn State. It just didn't matter. So Purdue's got to do a better job taking care of the basketball.
And that's certainly Matt Painter has been stressing that, and post-game, pre-game radio shows, whatever it takes, he's talking about the turnover figure. That's the number one limiter of this basketball team, or is it, and we've talked a lot about the statistical part of things, that defensively they look good on paper, but you wonder about that sometimes. But what do you see as the biggest limiter? Is it really as simple as better, more efficient possessions, getting that turnover number down to where Matt Painter likes it in the 8-9 level?
Well, there are all sorts of areas where Purdue can improve, but the one thing that has been inextricably linked to Purdue losing has been turnovers. I thought at Illinois you had some defensive issues. Butler, you had some defensive issues also, just in the sense that I don't know who Purdue's second guy is in terms of stopping somebody on the perimeter. Rafael Davis can only guard one guy at a time. And especially when the opponent has big men who can shoot, that can kind of neutralize Purdue's size, maybe drag A.J. Hammonds and Isaac Haas away from the basket a little bit, that kind of renders Purdue kind of vulnerable to some things defensively. I said all through non-conference, and a lot of people did, that when you watch Purdue play defense, they weren't as good as their numbers. And I think they've been exposed a little bit in Big Ten play. But the one thing that has led to losing has been turnovers. Purdue turned the ball over too much at Illinois. They turned the ball over way too much against Iowa. They turned the ball over way too much against Butler. That was the one thing, if they cleaned up in those three games, you don't know how those games would have turned out. So if you had to categorize things in terms of what Purdue has to improve most, taking care of the basketball is probably number one on that list.
You look at the schedule, and it is an interesting one for Purdue. The Boilermakers have a chance, really. You're starting to look at the Big Ten, and we'll ask Mike DeCourcy about this as well, the top 6 teams in the league. And Purdue has a favorable schedule in theory, with the next 5 games, 4 of them against teams that are not in that top 6. The only one that is against one of those top 6 teams is the return visit to Iowa. Mm-hmm. What do you take of that? I mean, obviously the Illinois loss is devastating because Illinois is, at least at this point, not a top 6 team. But and in terms of, can you make a run? I guess the long-winded way of saying, can you make a run of the Big Ten championship if you're Purdue where it sits right now?
I think Purdue's got to be playing well in February. I think you can get through this stretch if you're not playing as well as you can play. You might take a loss or two, but if you want to stay viable in the Big Ten race, and if you want to enhance your NCAA tournament stock, you have to play well in February, because that's when you have, I think, Maryland twice, you have Michigan State, and then you have
Indiana,
Nebraska, I believe, in a 4-game stretch. You also have the game in Bloomington. That is the stretch of games that's going to define Purdue's Big Ten season. There's a certain level of experimentation that Purdue has done here this year with this big lineup model that Matt Painter implemented to get Caleb Swanigan here, and that's going to be a process. It always was going to be a process, and I still think you're seeing some of the machinations of that process. And I think if Purdue can hit its stride at the right time, play well in February, and then maybe hit its peak come the end of the season when you have to finish off what you hope is a Big Ten championship run, and obviously position yourself for postseason success, be it in the Big Ten tournament and the NCAA tournament. That's kind of what you're shooting for right now.
Yeah, and I think that that's a reasonable and a challenge. And I think it's even look at a game last night with Michigan State losing now twice to Iowa and really getting hammered last night. I was very impressed was very impressed with Iowa when the Hawkeyes came to Mackey Arena on Rick Mountain night back on January 2nd. But is there a formula? Is it the small ball, even though Iowa doesn't completely play that way? Minnesota kind of did, Illinois kind of did. Is that going to also be something Purdue's got to be able to almost return the serve and make itself, kind of elevate itself to be somebody that it isn't right now in terms of being a team that you have to be able to figure out, because these small teams can cause some real problems for Purdue?
Yeah, I mean, I could talk all day about what the formula for success is, what the ideal matchup is, but Purdue's got to keep the game in the half court for the most part, defensively more than anything. They have to dominate the boards because that's what they're built to do.
Yeah.
And defensively, what you have to do is you have to make sure, in my opinion, their model should be close out on shooters as hard as you can, and if they get past you, make them finish over A.J. Hammonds, Isaac Haas, and Caleb Swanigan. That should be Purdue's defensive identity. When you have teams that can really, play on the perimeter, spread people out, especially when you have a big who can play away from the basket some, it really gives Purdue problems because of, as you get bigger, you get slower. I mean, that's just kind of common sense, and that's kind of where Purdue is right now. They recruited a lot of shooters to kind of overcorrect the skill issue from a few years ago. That left Purdue with maybe some lesser athletic guys out on the perimeter, maybe some guys who didn't come to Purdue with that sort of defensive mentality Purdue's always been known for. So that sort of left you with Rafael Davis as your only really high-level perimeter defender. So when you have a team like Illinois that's got two bases you have to cover like that, Malcolm Hill and Kendrick Nunn, you can only put Rafael Davis on one at a time. When you look at what Muhammad Ali Abdur-Rahman from Michigan, and I'm saying that as often as possible because I'm getting really good at it, did to Purdue, scoring 25 points in Karis LeVert's absence, and then when you saw both Hill and Kendrick Nunn go off at different times, it really kind of shined a light on the fact that Purdue could really use that second wing defender to emerge at some point to kind of alleviate that concern. But that's just kind of part of a pretty big picture that Purdue would have to have fall into place to be as good as they possibly can be.
All right, we want to thank our sponsors for tonight or for this afternoon, and they've been with us for a long time. Triple X sat with the last game with Kerry and Greg Erzman, enjoyed it very much. On the hill, but on the level, it's Purdue tradition since 1929. John Basham and the folks at Basham Reynolds, and they've been supportive of us, and they're already busy looking ahead to 2016-17 in terms of apartment rentals. And Hilton Garden Inn, when tomorrow is a big day, stay at HGI tonight. Christy Kuntz and her staff do a great job down at Wabash Landing. And State Farm agent Trent Johnson, trentismyagent.com. And Trent is, we say it every week, but I love getting my occasional text from Trent about what's going on in the world of Purdue sports. He's an analyst on his own right, certainly from knowing the topic. All right, you do look at some of the play of guys, and obviously Biggie Swanigan has been, for most part, very, very good. But like any freshman, there are times when you take a step back or you get challenged, you see something that you may not have seen at the level that you've played before. Evaluate how you see his performance and how that you're still as bullish on him as a long-term player as you've ever been, I assume.
As a long-term player, I don't think he's been as efficient, obviously, as I figured he would be, just because the player I saw in high school was very efficient. Something that has to be kept in mind about Caleb Swanigan, not only is he a freshman and subject to the process at play there, but he's also playing an entirely different position than he did in high school. Like I talked about, the big lineup model Matt Painter implemented to convince Caleb Swanigan to come to Purdue came with a lot of transition, and that included Swanigan transitioning from high school center to power forward, and it has been a real transition, and it has been a real transition defensively and offensively. The transitions come with obviously great players always have to adjust to what college defenses are doing to them. You know, Painter compares this to Glenn Robinson, where Glenn Robinson learned pretty quickly that he wasn't going to be able to do whatever he wanted because coaching and preparation and defenses are really good in college. That's part of the issue. The other part of the issue for Swanigan that kind of takes a little bit of the edge off that comparison is that Glenn Robinson wasn't moving to a completely different position.
Yeah.
Caleb Swanigan is. So the adjustment for him is even more pronounced than it was for Glenn Robinson. But Swanigan's still going to be really good. He makes them a much better rebounding team. Obviously, he's a very talented player. He's a good passer. He just needs to calm down. So I think he's overeager. And if I were great at something and I had an opportunity to go out and do it in front of thousands of people, I would probably be overeager to do that too. And that's just kind of where he is right now. He's a really good player, used to dominating people. He is wired to dominate. That's his natural instinct. And maybe he tries to do that a little more than he needs to at the expense of perhaps, Purdue's offensive flow. Obviously, it subjected him to a lot of turnovers. But he's got to get better defensively and offensively. I think he just needs to calm down a little bit. And you would think he would over time. He's a very smart, very hardworking kid. And I wouldn't think that, these problems are going to be permanent problems.
He also came back when he didn't forego a year of high school, but he's not, he's still relatively.
He did forego a year of high
Yeah,
school.
I mean, in
he
essence
played 3
did.
years of high school basketball.
Yeah, I mean,
but he made up for that with so much experience in between.
And I think that's, I'm just saying from a maturity standpoint, but I do think that that's a situation where you have to be able to, it's all about adjustment. And I do think that this team, too, is going to be how it does adjust to the way it is. And you can't change it right away, I think, as well. The point guard play is always a topic of discussion with this team. And what do you do, or how do you put your best lineup on the floor? Do you ever see a scenario where you're going to see somebody else at the point besides Johnny Hill and P.J. Thompson, or do you think that's going to be a staple throughout the course of the year?
I think against certain matchups, Purdue will put Dakota Mathias there sometimes. I think that's a good way to steal some minutes from Mathias. They have too many wings. They're better offensively when Dakota Mathias is on the floor. I think you might see him maybe pick up a couple of minutes here and there, but point guard's not the problem. When Purdue's been, aside from the Iowa game, the point guards weren't good in the Iowa game. But they weren't the problem at Illinois. I don't think they were the problem against Butler. P.J. Thompson has a 5-to-1 assist-to-turnover ratio. I know he's not dynamic. I know he's not a lot of things. I know Johnny Hill isn't a lot of things too. But what Purdue needs from those guys is to just be solid, to defend and take care of the basketball. And by and large, they've done that. I really don't think – I know they were the biggest personnel question coming into the season, but I don't think they're part of the problem if Purdue has problems right now. I think they've been what Purdue's needed them to be, and that's just reliable and solid. No one here has ever said those guys were going to be stars, and if people expected these guys to be, Chris Paul or whoever else, that was just never reality. But what Purdue needed them to do was not be liabilities, and I don't think they've been liabilities.
Yeah, that's what's an interesting part of this whole thing is just fitting it all together. There's a lot of, in games 1 through 11 with this basketball team, a lot that you liked, and again, it's going to be about adjustment in terms of how Purdue can ramp it up. With the teams you've seen so far, though, Iowa, obviously, they're very, very impressive in terms of how they've handled themselves. Anybody else around the league that has really surprised you in terms of, Indiana is off to an undefeated start and hasn't necessarily played. They don't play a lot of teams of the 6 teams we've talked about until March, but anybody else that's really has come out of the weeds that you think, or somebody that may come around that we're not talking about?
I thought Maryland would be playing a little better. Obviously they lost to Michigan, but before that, they had a bunch of scares. One at Wisconsin, one against, I believe, Penn State, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So in terms of surprises, I don't know if other than Iowa, there's anybody out there who's playing better than I thought they would. I thought Maryland would be playing at a higher level. Indiana obviously has gotten it together a little bit. Now it's kind of fool's gold a little bit because their start of their Big Ten schedule was so, manageable. We'll see what happens when things ramp up for them here later. But they seem to have gotten things figured out. A lot of their issues from Maui seem to not be as pronounced as they were. But we'll obviously see whether they're able to make sure that endures.
Yeah, the Hoosiers have a really good schedule, an advantageous schedule. At least they've only played Maryland, Michigan State, and Purdue once. I think they do have Iowa twice in that fold, and not until February. So Indiana will be interesting to see how that they play out. Let's move to football recruiting. Obviously, this is a key time for Purdue as it puts together its 2016 class, a relatively small class. We've been talking about that for a long time. 15 commitments. It's a moving target,
It is a
obviously.
moving target, so.
And that's certainly. I do think that that's something that we have the ability to be able to get to. Purdue has to have the ability to retain these guys down the stretch. What are you seeing now with all the visits? Big weekend this weekend, obviously, with a lot of visitors.
Yeah, the drama, to some extent, is going to, from here on out, is going to lie on the offensive line. Purdue also needs a quarterback. That's a big deal. But I think the offensive line is going to be a really interesting saga from here on out. Jim Bridge just left a couple weeks before National Signing Day. Purdue had 2 high school offensive linemen committed. Dylan Powell's already withdrawn that commitment. I'm guessing Purdue probably would have lost him anyhow, even if Jim Bridge hadn't left. Virginia Tech, Iowa State, Rutgers, Georgia Tech, a bunch of people came in and offered him late in the process. The coaching carousel was really kind to him. A bunch of coaches he knew moved to better jobs and came after him. So Purdue's already lost Dylan Powell. That's a big one because Purdue needed a center, and center's a niche deal in recruiting. You have to pick out a specific guy for that position, and that's going to be a hard one to replace at the last second. Luke Campbell, the kid from Ohio, I know is a kid Purdue really likes. A lot of people really like. Syracuse and Iowa State have offered him lately. The Bridge thing is going to impact him probably. Whether he's going to take any more visits, I don't know. Jalen Neal was a junior college guy they signed mid-year after recruiting him for 4 days. And it turned out he couldn't come mid-year. So the drama with the offensive line has already begun, and it's only gonna ramp up now because Purdue's got to hold on to Luke Campbell, and they have to replace anybody that they don't
If they lose,
they don't hold on to. So it's going to be a really active next couple weeks here on the offensive line front.
I think 3 commitments in the class right now, not including Powell, obviously, that from a defensive line standpoint.
Defensive or offensive?
Offensive line standpoint, and that is a key figure.
2.
Could
Luke
you down?
Campbell and Jalen Neal are the 2 offensive linemen.
Oh, I thought they had one more.
Alex Criddle's a defensive lineman.
Okay.
I don't know why we have him listed for offense.
That's where I messed up. So, again, so that is going to be, has been talked about as being a key position. Obviously, Purdue, I think, has listed on our list 5 defensive backs. That also will be important that Purdue is able to maintain those guys down the stretch. Signing day, February 3rd, and that is not very far away. And that's going to be, like I said, it's been more of a drama certainly with Purdue over the last couple of years in terms of trying to hold on guys. We do have a question that I'm going back to basketball for Brian that I wanted to ask if I can pull it back up here. A comment from Zach in terms of if this team doesn't get far in the tournament. Has this been a case of the coaching staff, Matt Painter, not being able to handle the depth correctly? I mean, do you think that's been how much value do you place in that? The fact that you had to be able to really function with 9-10 deep. Is that because?
Yeah.
I don't know if that's going to change either.
Well, first off, the one thing I would say is that if this season doesn't turn out like a lot of people hoped, like a lot of people seem to have come to expect, I think a lot of it comes back to the fact that, the way I like to put it is I think Matt Painter doubled down on a good team to try to make it a great team by implementing the Caleb Swanigan model, as I guess we can call it, moving to these big lineups when everybody else is going small. That was going to be a process, to some extent, an experiment all along. No one knew how that was going to turn out. Obviously, there were a lot of expectations given the talent level collectively of this team, but this isn't a complete team, and there were some limitations to what Purdue was going to put out on the floor. The other part of it is Purdue's got too many players.
Yeah.
They just really do. I know that sounds like a good problem to have, but it is a problem nonetheless. And when you can't get enough minutes for guys on the wing, for example, to get them into rhythms, and you have guys playing, 15 minutes when maybe they'd be really good if they were playing 30, that is a problem. And I don't know what you do as a coach to deal with that, aside from just picking 2 of those 3 guys and only playing those guys. And things could ultimately go in that direction for all we know, but Ryan Klein did not redshirt. It was worth it because Ryan Klein got you your biggest win of the season to date at Pitt. But really, it is a challenge to juggle all of these players. And I think if this season maybe doesn't turn out that way, or if this season doesn't turn out the way a lot of people wanted it to or hoped, maybe you look back at that and said, man, it would have been good if Purdue had 7 players instead of 10 in its rotation. But I'm only speculating. Obviously, there's a lot of season left.
A lot of season left. All right, we're going to take a quick break. Mike DeCourcy is on the line. We'll be back with him, and we'll be back here shortly to be able to talk more Big Ten basketball with one of the experts, not only at the Big Ten Network, but nationally with us on Gold and Black Live. So stay tuned. We'll be back in a couple of minutes.